Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome Dr. Stephen Hahn, the 24th Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. We are so pleased to have you today.
Thank you, Esther. Really appreciate the invitation and look forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. Well, a lot has happened since the last time you and I spoke back in June. What, of course, is still very relevant is that we're in the midst of the pandemic. And what's top of mind for everyone is vaccines. And I know that's an issue that you've been working on quite closely as well. So, why don't we start with vaccines? Tomorrow, October 22nd, is the much anticipated Vaccine Advisory Committee. And as we've been told, Moderna and Pfizer will be there presenting on their candidates, though not presenting data on phase 3 clinical trials. So, can you tell us a little bit more about what this committee is and what decisions are going to be made tomorrow?
For sure, Esther. And I'll start off with a general description. The Vaccines and Related Biologics Products Advisory Committee, their job is to review and evaluate data concerning the safety, effectiveness, and appropriate use of vaccines and related biological products. And this committee also considers the quality and the relevance of FDA's research program, which provides scientific support for regulation of this product. Now, the committee is composed of members who are knowledgeable in a number of different fields: immunology, of course, vaccine policy, molecular biology, DNA virology, et cetera. And they're incredibly helpful to the agency in terms of making decisions around specific products, but also about our understanding in general of our approach to vaccines. So really, the discussion tomorrow is designed, at least in part, to help ensure that the public understands that the required legal standards will be met, whether we use one pathway, which is the standard approval called the BLA or Biological License Approval Pathway, or the Emergency Use Authorization Pathway, or what's been described as EUA, so that they can feel comfortable receiving any vaccine that's either authorized or approved by FDA. And the process will be transparent and independent. Any safety and effectiveness data that we receive at a future vaccine committee will be public, and the committee's discussion will be public. For tomorrow, what the committee will be doing is just a general discussion regarding the approach that we've outlined for our either authorization or approval of a vaccine. And we expect there to be conversation about the EUA, or Emergency Use Authorization guidance, that we put and made public in early October.
Well, thank you for that. I know a lot of people are looking forward to that public discussion. In June, the FDA released guidance to product sponsors and manufacturers of vaccines in terms of what they can expect for review of safety and efficacy. The agency has also recently updated that guidance. Can you tell us about what was in the June guidance versus what was recently released by FDA?
For sure. So the June guidance was a general outline of what we expected to see with respect to data, but also, very importantly, what we expected to see with respect to the conduct, particularly of the phase 3 clinical trials. So one important point there is that we made it clear that we expected to see diversity in the clinical trials. And let me explain what I mean by that. That certainly means ethnic diversity. That certainly means age diversity, because we know that many groups in the United States and around the globe are disproportionately affected, both by the disease and exposure to it, but also by having relatively serious outcomes related to this. So we wanted to make sure that the elderly were represented. We wanted to make sure that there was diversity with respect to ethnicity, but we also wanted to make sure that there was diversity with respect to having underlying health conditions, comorbidities, as we describe those. So that was one part of it. The other was, what do we want to see with respect to efficacy? And we defined as a floor for the vaccine a 50% rate of efficacy of any COVID-19 vaccine. And why that was important is that it allowed the companies that are developing these vaccines to design their trials to detect that floor. And you've probably seen in the press that these trials have a minimum of 30,000 subjects, 15,000 who've received or are receiving placebo, and 15,000 that are receiving the active vaccine. And some of them, of course, have exceeded that number. We thought it was very important to outline exactly what we wanted to see. Now, the we of course want a vaccine that's as effective as possible, but we really decided to look at a floor, our experts did, of 50%. Now, with respect to the early October guidance, that was particularly focused on emergency use authorization. And just very briefly, not to spend too much time on this, emergency use authorization is a very special, in statute, authority that was granted to us by Congress after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, so that we could expedite medical products into the hands of providers and consumers. And so we've been using that pathway, the emergency use authorization. But with respect to vaccines, be determined by the developers of vaccines whether they use that pathway or our standard biological license application pathway. But the guidance in early October was to outline what did we want to see specifically around emergency use authorizations. And so we again emphasized very much the efficacy data that we needed to see and reiterated what we had put out in the June guidance. And the bottom line for this is that what the agency wants to see is our data from at least one well-performed, randomized, adequately powered phase 3 clinical trial comparing vaccine to placebo in order to make the determination around safety and efficacy. We also issued a recommendation for a 2-month follow-up period to examine the continuing effects of any vaccine, both in terms of efficacy and with respect to safety. And this is the important part of this. To arrive at the 2-month figure, our career scientists looked at several factors like past approvals, safety assessments of other medical products, and we concluded that the 2-month follow-up for safety was the sweet spot for providing adequate safety data, while at the same time understanding that we had an urgent public health situation and we wanted to make as expeditious of a determination as possible. Now, we've communicated this to the vaccine sponsors, but we've also made it clear this is our expectation of the minimum data that we're going to need to see, and we will not cut corners in making this determination. We expect to see these data if someone wants to come forward with an emergency use authorization, and we're going to be very transparent with the public about the data.
Let's pick up on that comment about the 2-month follow-up data. One of the questions that everybody has top of mind is, what is the expected timeline? When can we expect to see a vaccine candidate, a successful candidate, either through emergency use authorization, if that's the pathway the manufacturer takes, and or through full licensure? So can you talk a little bit about that? What can we expect by the end of this year and then potentially into the first quarter of next year?
So, Esther, I've said several times, don't have a crystal ball. I was a cancer doctor before I became FDA commissioner. I told my patients that, and I'll say that to you. I can't prejudge when the data will be available. Now, what we know in these phase 3 clinical trials is that the sponsors use the criteria that we establish with respect to effectiveness, and they have pre-specified efficacy endpoints. So in their trial, there are certain events, that is the acquisition of COVID-19 disease in the people who've received the vaccine. When they get to that level where the data are mature, and this is determined by an independent data safety monitoring board, that's when these manufacturers, these developers will come to us with the data in an application. We will, of course, provide technical assistance to them. We will help them through the process. Our expectation is that many will come forward in the emergency use authorization process, but we've also made it clear that we expect them to also apply at some point in the very near future if they do go through the EUA process with a biological license application. And so once that occurs, we don't have a pre-specified timeline for review. We want to expedite it. We've said that we will schedule a vaccine advisory committee to review those data. We have committed for every application to have a vaccine advisory committee. We will make that public, as I mentioned. Our scientists will make an initial determination. We'll ask specific questions about the product from the vaccine advisory committee, and then we will incorporate that in our decision making. At the end of the day, only our career scientists in the Center for Biologics Evaluation Research will be making this decision, and they will be making it solely upon the science and data that come from the clinical trials.
Earlier this week, Secretary Azar mentioned that he's optimistic that a vast majority of the American people can have access to a vaccine by the spring. And I know you just talked about the process. You can't peer into a crystal ball. But do you agree with that timeline that by spring, the majority of the American people will have access to a COVID-19 vaccine?
So I think that's the goal, and that really is something that Operation Warp Speed within Health and Human Services, run by Secretary Azar, have been focused on. And it will really depend on a number of factors. What I can tell you are some of the things that FDA's done. We have been working with the manufacturers from day one for this entire development process and have used a rolling review. What we've also done is we've been working with the manufacturers around the actual manufacturing process, because one of our responsibilities is whether the vaccine's manufactured today or in December or in April, we need to make sure that there's quality and consistency and that every lot has the same ability to provide protection to all of Americans. So we've been working very closely, and I'm really happy to report that that is going very well. We have a lot of confidence in the manufacturing of these developers, and we will be doing our part with respect to working with them to make sure that manufacturing can be ramped up as quickly as possible.
Yeah. At the same time, what we're dealing with are issues with regard to vaccine hesitancy. And we have seen consistently since the spring a decrease in confidence in terms of the population that wants to get a COVID-19 vaccine. We've seen some states, for example, Governor Newsom in California, Governor Cuomo in New York, a recent release of a statement by SEIU representing over 2 million healthcare workers. They want an independent verification on safety and efficacy. How do you respond to that in terms of increased confidence, both with the scientific community, but also the general public, that whatever vaccine makes it out of this process will have safety and efficacy?
Well, I can tell you personally, but also the agency has definitely concerns about vaccine hesitancy. And as you know, Esther, this is something that preceded COVID-19. This, of course, this pandemic has, we've seen an increase in that, as you mentioned. So as commissioner, it's my responsibility to help explain why support for and confidence in the FDA is justified. And if a national vaccine campaign is going to be successful, the American public has to have full trust in the FDA's review process so that they can make an informed choice about receiving the vaccine. Every one of the decisions we have reached and will reach will be made by FDA scientists based on science and data and not outside pressure or politics. Our scientists are very, very skilled. They are known and renowned around the world for their ability to make the absolute best decisions regarding safety and effectiveness of a vaccine. We have a track record that, in my opinion, is unparalleled, and they will be the ones making this decision. We will not authorize or approve any vaccine that we would not feel comfortable taking ourselves or giving to our own families. And as I mentioned, our career staff, incredibly dedicated, 17,000 plus, they will be involved in our decision makings for all of medical products, and those with specific vaccine expertise will do so. So in addition to reassuring everyone that science will guide our decisions, the other part of this is having conversations like this one with you, outlining the process, being clear about what that process is like, and also being very clear and transparent about the criteria that we're going to use to make that decision. And then finally, it's our job to be transparent about those criteria, to let folks know that these are the data that we have. And to the extent that we're allowed by law, we will be very transparent and open with the public about the data and how we made our decision. I think those are steps that we can take to really improve vaccine confidence. And finally, I think it's really important for the American public to know that FDA not only looks at the specific data around a vaccine that's in front of us in an application, but we have access to a lot of data that others, including the states, other groups, don't have access to. We incorporate the totality of data in making decisions about medical products. And that is why FDA has the independent regulatory authority. That's why it's considered the gold standard for review and authorization and approval, if appropriate, based upon the science and the data.
Mhm. Well, those high standards are critical, not just here in the US, but around the world as well. Let's turn and talk about therapeutics. We've certainly heard a lot about monoclonal antibodies. I know there are applications before the FDA right now, requests for emergency use authorization of monoclonal antibodies. And you can't speak, of course, specifically to what's before the FDA. But from your perspective, as you look across the therapeutic landscape, what is the most promising therapeutics, and when can we expect to see effective treatments for patients, hopefully before the end of the year or into the first part of 2021?
Well, Esther, obviously, as soon as possible. It's an urgent issue for the country. And so I just want to make a quick distinction because I think the viewers of this chat might have heard a few confusing terms. We often say, because it's our regulatory speak, that we don't have any approved products for the treatment of COVID-19, and that is correct. What we do have is authorized therapeutics for COVID-19, and just an example, remdesivir being one of them. And of course, as you mentioned, it's in the public domain, applications for monoclonal antibodies. There are over 350 clinical trials ongoing in the United States related to potential therapeutics for COVID-19. We've seen some early data that has been made public by companies regarding monoclonal antibodies. And monoclonal antibodies have been effective in other diseases such as Ebola. So we have hope that these agents might be effective in patients with COVID-19. And of course, we'll be reviewing data to look at these applications moving forward. But there are a number of clinical trials going forward with antivirals, with therapies related to the treatment of the inflammatory response that we see in COVID-19 patients who are sick and in the hospital. And all of those are part of trials that are under the auspices of the FDA. We don't ever prejudge what those trials will show. And we are in the business, frankly, of being an independent regulator that calls the balls and strikes associated with those therapies. But what I can promise the American people is that we will do our absolute best to expedite the review of any data that comes before the agency. But again, we're going to use our gold standard to assess this. With respect to emergency use authorization, the statutory, the legal authority to us is to authorize a product that may be effective and where the risk is lower than the benefit, where the benefit outweighs the risk. And if I could just dissect that for a minute, if you think about therapeutics, if you're looking at a therapeutic, for example, to treat someone who's sick and potentially even sick on a ventilator in an ICU, that evaluation of risk versus benefit is different than a vaccine, because a vaccine is going into individuals who are healthy. And so the risk-benefit ratio has to incorporate the fact that there are people who would be getting a vaccine who aren't sick with COVID-19, whereas a therapeutic, we're talking about people who might be sick with the actual infection. So we certainly want to expedite, but our scientists are experts at making these decisions about risk-benefit analysis, and all of those factors will be incorporated in our decision-making.
We can continue on, and I only have a few minutes left with you. I am interested, however, in your perspective of the WHO Solidarity Trial's recent results that remdesivir is not as effective as we thought. You talked about we don't have approved therapies necessarily, but we have authorized therapies, and remdesivir certainly is in that toolbox. Any reaction to the WHO Solidarity result?
Yeah, I think it's really important to think about the data that we used at the FDA for our authorization. And there were 3 clinical trials that were performed, randomized, that informed our decision. So some of the highest level data that are out there. I think it's also important to think about what clinical settings the trials were performed on, the patient populations, and the other part of this, which sometimes gets lost in the discussion, what was the primary endpoint? What were we actually asking in these trials, and what answer did we have? And as you know, the World Health Organization trial looked at mortality as an endpoint. A number of the other trials that were performed in the United States and in other countries looked at time to recovery, both very important clinical endpoints. So what's important at the end of the day are what are the data pointing to, and did they show a statistically significant effect that we think is clinically meaningful in the context of a risk-benefit ratio and an active infection that still is with us around the world?
Mm-hmm. Just 2 questions before we close out. The first is, the big question, when can we gather in large numbers again? And how do you think about the role of vaccines, therapeutics, testing, and public health measures in getting us back to normal? Don't we need all of the above?
All the things that you mentioned are an important part of the public health response. This virus is still with us. It's with us around the world. We're seeing that. So the mitigation factors we've been talking about that are common sense, wearing a mask, social distancing, hand washing. When you can't hand wash, use hand sanitizer, and also protecting the vulnerable. All of those are really important factors. We have silent spread of this disease around the world because many people, particularly the young among us, have asymptomatic disease, which is different from a lot of other diseases that we're used to dealing with. So that's the first prong of this. And testing, of course, is an important component. It's why at FDA we've prioritized point of care tests recently, as well as rapid tests, because we realize that we want tests that can be done very quickly at the point of care and hopefully that are inexpensive and that can be sort of used across the spectrum, workplaces, nursing homes, universities. And we've seen some really terrific examples of that. And then, of course, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we have therapeutics that are available. And I think we're in a very different place than we were in March and April with respect to therapeutics. We've seen the case fatality rate, the mortality rate associated with this across all age groups go down. That is an incredible testimony to the biomedical research, but also the clinical care that occurs in this country. And then, of course, vaccines. When we think about vaccine hesitancy, if you could point to one of the most important and significant public health measures that we've seen over the last 100 years, it's vaccines. Think of smallpox and the eradication of the disease. Think of measles and the impact that vaccines have had on these diseases. Very, very important for us to remember. So as we know that COVID-19 is still with us, we also know that one of the ways, and really most significant and important ways we'll put it behind us, is to have a safe and effective vaccine. Just to put a finer point on that, FDA's job is to look at the data. We, of course, want to expedite this because every one of us wants to put COVID-19 behind us, but we will not cut corners, and we will only use science and data to make that determination by our career scientists at FDA.
We're out of time, but I'm just going to ask one last question in 30 seconds, which is the agency has gone through a lot in the last 8 to 10 months. What's the biggest lesson learned for you as commissioner as you think about the role of FDA going forward?
So we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot about our emergency use authorization process. I mean, think about it. The number of EUAs that we've issued is 10 times more than all of the other public health emergencies combined. We are performing a pandemic review. We should have that information relatively soon, where we're looking back at a number of issues: communications, our processes, decision-making, clinical trials, all of those factors. How can we better respond in the future? What have we done well? What can we keep? And in fact, what can we apply in normal circumstances outside of a pandemic? So more to come on that. And I can assure you, FDA is a learning organization. We have fully embraced this review process, and we'll have a lot of information moving forward about what we can keep and what we can do improving as we look to the next couple of years.
Well, thank you so much, Commissioner, for joining us, for sharing your thoughts and perspective, continuing to underscore the role of science. We wish you the very best and the agency as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther. Really appreciate the time, and my best to your viewers.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Damian Garde. I'm a biotech reporter at STAT. Today, in this panel, we're going to discuss how companies across the healthcare spectrum are innovating to improve patients' access to care during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. And we are joined today by experts from all across that spectrum. We have Megan Callahan, who is a vice president of healthcare at Lyft. We have Angela Wong, who is group president of biopharmaceuticals at Pfizer. And we have Meena Seshamani, who is vice president of clinical care transformation at MedStar Health. So this might seem like a disparate cross-section of experts. Thank you all for being with me. Sorry, I was waiting for your video to come on. But as we discussed before, each of you plays a role in what's often described as the patient's journey in our healthcare system. And so I was thinking maybe before we talk about innovation in the time of COVID and how it might inform the future, maybe we could go around and kind of discuss the role each of you plays in that journey as we conceive of it. So maybe Angela, starting with you, where does Pfizer come on in the patient journey?
Well, thank you, Damien. And hello to everyone. It's great to be here. Well, we're a pharmaceutical company, and so our role is to provide medicines. But actually, in the way that we provide these medicines, patients are at the core of how we think about, the entire, our entire business. It begins with understanding what the patient's unmet needs are from a disease perspective, and we use that as our compass to design drugs. Right? So we go into drug discovery, and from there, patients participate in our clinical trials. And it's these clinical trials that inform us as to whether the drug can or cannot be successful. Even if we get regulatory approval, our work for patients isn't done because we need to help patients and support them in their diagnosis, right? If they are not diagnosed, they won't be able to get the treatment that they need. And once they're diagnosed, we have to support them in accessing treatments appropriately. And there's so many different facets of access that are important, and I'm sure we'll discuss this afternoon. And then we also need to help patients to stay compliant on their medicines once they get them. So, from the beginning to the end, the patients are really at the center of every single thing that we do and are core to the decisions that we make to ensure that we bring the best medicines, the best therapies to the right patients at the right time for their treatment.
And so, Megan, I think everyone watching has an idea of what Lyft's core business is, of course, but specifically in healthcare, how does the company kind of interact with patients in that care spectrum?
Sure, happy to describe that. So obviously what Lyft brings to the table is an on-demand transportation network. And we entered the healthcare scene in 2016, so almost 5 years ago, recognizing that there was really a challenge in getting patients to the care that they need. So we're primarily focused on decreasing transportation as a barrier to care. I want to take a step back and just describe how Lyft works. Lyft Healthcare works. It's a little different than you calling a Lyft through your phone to go to dinner. We've created a business-to-business platform, which allows organizations that want to sponsor rides for patients to arrange that ride for the patient or member, and then pay for that ride for the patient or member. So who we partner with primarily on the healthcare side are health insurers, health systems, and also transportation managers or transportation brokers who are basically administering a transportation benefit. Medicaid has covered transportation as part of its benefit program since the program's inception in the 1960s. Medicare Advantage, which is obviously one of the fastest rising payers in the United States, is increasingly covering things like transportation. Health systems have a need often to pay for transportation themselves, so non-insurance covered rides if they're trying to get patients discharged and home or into their facility for appointments. So we really focus on access to care, and our prime value proposition is around increasing operational efficiency, decreasing cost. We're typically 30% cheaper than other transportation options, and really accessing care and increasing patient satisfaction.
So, Mina, at the risk of this being maybe kind of an obvious question, but what role does MedStar play in the patient care continuum?
So, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with such a distinguished group of speakers as well. So, MedStar Health is an integrated health system in the Maryland, D.C. area. 10 hospitals, 300 plus outpatient care sites, home health, urgent cares, medical group, etc. So to Damien's point, perhaps a little bit obvious about the role in the patient journey, but what I would say is what's really important about what we do is how we make that a patient journey, how we have people at the center of what we do, such that we are connecting and integrating across the various aspects of care, be it from community health, starting all the way in the community at home, to our ambulatory sites, to like office visits, for example, to our hospitals, our tertiary quaternary care centers, and really making sure that we are connecting all of that with the patient and for the patient and their families so that they get that more comprehensive approach to their care so that they can stay healthy and get healthy when they are sick.
So the pandemic has obviously disrupted just about every industry. It's why I think most people listening to this are in their homes rather than where they otherwise would be on a Wednesday afternoon. But for some industries, it's been a derailing force. For others, it's been transforming. I think in healthcare, we've seen that it's kind of brought in a wave of innovation. And so I was kind of curious for each of you how you've pivoted in the face of the pandemic in order to to continue to do your work, and what kinds of innovation you've brought on because of it. Perhaps starting with Megan, how is Lyft Healthcare reacting to, I guess, the past 9 months of life in the United States?
Yeah, well, I think it's been an interesting ride for all of us. No pun intended there, I guess. Over the past 9 months, we've been focused on a couple things relative to COVID. First and foremost is making sure that our riders are as safe as possible. So we've instituted a health and safety pledge where, of course, drivers and riders have to wear masks, have windows down, things of that nature. We did see certain organizations, certain state government entities, actually for non-emergent medical transportation, which is the field in which we work, mandate that organizations could not use public transportation anymore. They could not put people in multi-load vehicles. Think of a shuttle with 6 to 8 patients in it because it's an economical way to get patients to care. So we did see in some areas real demand for us, not only to get patients to care, but also to get essential workers into their facilities. So we transported over 10,000 doctors, nurses, other hospital staff because the health systems really needed to make sure when public transport shut down that they could get in and serve COVID patients. And I think the third big thing that we saw is a real need to get things to people as we are all in our homes. So for instance, we had delivery on our product roadmap for much later in the year, and we moved that way up and started to deliver food, medical supplies to those in need, working with organizations like the Army of Angels or health plans and food banks. People who are more vulnerable, generally people of color, people of lower socioeconomic status, can stay at home but still get the things that they need. So that is something that we definitely focused on.
And Angela, how has Pfizer had to innovate to continue to do all the things that you discussed from discovery to delivery at the very end in this time of COVID?
Yeah, I think it's been such a big change for all of us. What we're experiencing here today, right? Working from home and staying connected with colleagues or our customers through the virtual setting has really defined a whole new way for us to work. But I would say that the biggest change is really moving us from what we knew as being good, which is a lot of face-to-face interaction, right? So think about it from the perspective of us developing medicines for diseases in order for us to understand these unmet needs. We do a lot of market research. We're constantly with patients. Once we know what it is that our program should entail, we then run clinical trials, and that is also a lot of people interaction. And then if I think about the way that we then help our customers, both physicians as well as patients, understand our medicines, it's through education. And that is also time. And so our entire business, which was just almost 100% face-to-face, we had to rethink how is it that we need to continue to do this critical work, but in a time where we really have to be virtual. So starting with the clinical trials, we leveraged a ton of technology, but we also thought about how it is that we need to ensure that we can continue to engage patients in our clinical trials through using more virtual mechanisms, but also technologies like patient diaries, electronic patient diaries, knowing that patients where we would have greater difficulty getting information if there was manually captured. So by creating electronic patient diaries so that patients, while on clinical trials, could capture their day-to-day or, the important information. That then made their information almost, real time for us to be able to collect. And that, in fact, is one of the reasons why we were able to speed up our clinical trials for the COVID vaccine, which we can also talk about later. So here's a dimension of something that was very manual, very face-to-face, and something that turned on its head in an incredibly productive and positive way that has allowed us to do something that typically would take us much longer, with much greater speed and with much greater connection with patients, because it's real time. I would say on the other front, talking about education, we spend a lot of our time really educating our customers about our diseases, as well as the new mechanisms of action that underpin the medicines that we bring to market. And so if I think about the last 8 months, we have had a number of new product launches, meaning new medicines, new molecular entities to treat diseases as devastating as cancer, colorectal cancer. And we did typically things that we would do real life, and we would never imagine to do this virtually. We had no option but to do virtually. So that also turned our business, on its head. But we learned, so many tremendous things. I think, first of all, it forced us to use virtual channels that others typically would have been reticent to do. And it also helped us to understand how to engage our customers in different ways. And we also learned how it is that we could create content that is engaging, and being able to, continue this engagement and the relationships and partnerships for learning about new drugs, new products, very devastating diseases, to how we can support our patients. So I would say that, digital was always at the core of what we did, but because we believed in the human interaction so much, I don't know that we always had enough guts to sort of like go to the other side and to fully implement all the virtual tools that we had. Here we were really confronted with a situation where we had no option. And I think we find ourselves now in a place where not only as we all of us as colleagues and as professionals have just much greater confidence in how to use these electronic tools and technology, but what we've also realized is that the ability to communicate with our customers and with our stakeholders actually can be very wide, and the range of how we communicate with them can be really wide, and that there are definitely different mechanisms and different preferences that we can now use. And I think that we've been able to really, expand our range much more so than where we were a few months ago. So I think it's been a net positive. I think the face-to-face, you can never really get away from that. And we're really, looking forward to the day when we can resume that. But in its place, I think we've found tremendously effective mechanisms that we are very interested in. And I think that we can do a whole lot more with.
So yeah, Mina, on that same topic, I mean, we've all spent a lot of time thinking about or reading about, the care for patients who have COVID-19 or the prevention of it. But obviously, MedStar is a hospital that serves a great many more people. So I was curious, how did you adapt in terms of the normal care that you would be able to provide in a non-pandemic time, in a time in which a lot of those face-to-face interactions are probably impossible?
Yeah, certainly. We certainly adapted with the pandemic in terms of, turning ORs into ERs and establishing alternate sites of care for the influx of patients coming in. But I think perhaps in a more nuanced way, being able to leverage our technologies to improve access for patients both with COVID and without COVID, not only in the more traditional sense of turning ambulatory visits into video visits, which we ramped up, as did other health systems, really demonstrating tremendous agility where initial investments in innovation were able to be turned on a dime to be able to provide access for people who could not come in person for visits. But there are also ways that we leverage that technology in slightly more nuanced ways. So for example, within the hospital, leveraging telehealth for consults, because in an environment where you want to preserve your PPE, your personal protective equipment, Can you engage with patients through video technology, even within the hospital, so that you don't have people constantly going in and out of rooms? And especially for things like palliative care and other fields where a lot of it is discussion with people, sometimes being able to see a full face, even if on a screen, is better than having a mask and full gown and everything to really engage. Another example is partnering with skilled nursing facilities and other types of care providers where we can leverage telehealth along with on-the-ground support to be able to help with infection control, provide guidance on how they use their PPE, if patients become sick, to help them with cohorting those patients, and also to be able to triage, okay, this person is looking sick, we have an ED bunker where we can just, through telehealth, have one of our ED docs take a look at the patient and determine, is this someone who needs to come in, and facilitate that ED transfer. And then taking that also to the community, because as we know, COVID-19 and the pandemic have exposed a lot of the disparities that exist in our healthcare system and in our communities. And we've been able to leverage our community health workers who cannot go into the home as much now, but in a virtual way, so that both to prevent COVID-19, assist people with isolation protocols, because it's not always easy to stay at home and stock up your freezer with food. What were food insecurities to begin with become amplified in this kind of environment. So how can we leverage telehealth to both proactively reach out to these communities to help them as they're trying to prevent getting sick? And then when you have someone who's had COVID, say they've been in the hospital for 2 weeks, now they have to go home. Do they have medications? To Megan's point, do they have transportation? What is their housing situation? How are they going to get food? Because they need to isolate for potentially a week or two. And so being able to leverage our community health workers and other social supports linked to community-based organizations, utilizing a telehealth and other technological platforms so that you can, in essence, virtually wrap your arms around our communities so that we're providing that smooth and safe recovery pathway for people, and that also helps prevent spread of the virus.
So a lot of the innovations we've discussed were definitely brought about by COVID and were made necessary in order to get the important work that you all do done during a time in which the standard ways of doing things are impossible. But I was curious, actually, maybe starting with Megan, is there any key lesson you learned in this time of adaptation that is applicable in a post-pandemic world that maybe changed the way you think about how lived healthcare will move forward?
Well, I think there's a lot of lessons. If I look over the course of the past 6 to 9 months, I think one thing that I've been most concerned about is people delaying care altogether because of COVID. So, a lot of what we do is dialysis, where people have to go 3 times a week, chemo appointments, opioid use disorder. People have to go in and get methadone every day. And we were seeing in the beginning, many people delay really critical types of healthcare services because of fear. So to me, getting the word out around transportation and access is incredibly important, and making people feel that they're in a safe environment is very important to our work going forward. I think certainly a lot of what we've also done is spend a lot of time with forward-thinking policymakers in Medicaid agencies. For us to be used in Medicaid, we have to be part of a Medicaid program. And we enrolled in our first Medicaid program in 2019, summer of 2019. And since that time, we've been now enrolled in 15 programs, which means that we can be used in those states as a first choice for transportation, and those patients can benefit from everything that I've talked about previously. Because of COVID, certain states accelerated through waivers the use of rideshare and of Lyft as well. So I think taking that model and what those states have done and showing other states the benefits that we've been able to provide in terms of decreased ED use, increased closing primary gaps in care, also increased HEDIS measures and quality measures. So some real tangible benefits around health outcomes that we've been able to show over the past 9 months. So taking those lessons and applying them going forward is something that we'll be focused on.
Angela, maybe more specific to Pfizer, some of the things you described about changing the way you do clinical trials or the way you do patient outreach. How much of what you've done or had to do under COVID is something that you think could inform future practices once, the old way is safe once more? Is there anything you learned that it's just a better way of doing business?
Well, I mean, I think that there are just so many aspects of what we have learned and how we've changed over the last several months that put us on a path that is, permanently different. And I think that, if I think about, some of the comments that I shared prior, which is we were used to doing things one way. So let's just take the face-to-face interactions, right? We knew how to do that. And now we are going completely the other way, which is we can only have interactions virtually. But what it will mean when we are out of the pandemic and we are able to resume, more usual habits is that now we've learned how to exist in both worlds. And so, options widen. And as you widen options, you have greater creativity in terms of how you can respond to your customers, because some people will still want the face-to-face. Maybe some people want a little bit of both. Others may want only virtual. So I think this is really just, I see every facet of how we do business, changed, and that it's given us much greater confidence to be able to respond and to increase the variability and also the offerings that we have in terms of how we communicate. But with or without COVID, I think some of the things that remain, incredibly important in the way that we continue to conduct our business, which we haven't touched upon yet. But Megan, you talked about a little bit, which is, thinking about patient access to medicine. From your perspective, it's transportation. From our perspective, access means how can we ensure that whether it's from a reimbursement perspective or from an insurance perspective or whatever coverage plan that you're on, that is something that we continue to advocate for and to ensure that patients have expanded access, right? Because unless we can have the greatest medicine, but unless you are able to somehow, be able to procure it, you're not going to be able to take it. So this aspect of access is something that is very important to us, and we've been working on for a really long time, with or without COVID. But the part that is really interesting is one where one could really contemplate a different world where instead of paying for a price per pill, right, which is how we do business today, you could contemplate working with payers, insurance companies, whoever the payers are, to say, how about we pay for outcomes? And you pay for the number of strokes decreased, or you pay for the length of remission in a certain pool of oncology patients. So these are the kinds of things that we would like to continue to work on, because we think that these are valuable insights and probably become even more important post-COVID, given how challenging and how much pressure has been on the healthcare system throughout COVID. So I think about that is one area. I think I'm going to put another one out there that we haven't talked about today, which is a little bit like it's a bit of a parallel to what Megan said, which is about how to get medicines to patients. She talked about bringing patients to physicians' offices or helping to get their care. But for me, thinking about medicines, there's another aspect. Think about drones. So we have a partnership with a company called Zipline, and we started earlier, in fact, last year, really exploring how we can use drone delivery as a way to get medicines into the hands of patients. Our pilots and our experiments began in the developing world because the challenges to getting medicines there are very obvious, right? It could be days before you can access a particular hospital, or if you need a medicine very quickly, how do you get that? So I think about that drone partnership that we have, which today happens to be the emerging world and the developing world, but a technology that actually could have great applicability and help with access as well in different circumstances in the developed world. So I think that's another area of innovation and sort of like technology enablement that I think we can also look forward to further exploring and it's not a COVID specific thing. It's just something that we know is important. And COVID, I think, has made it much more prominent. But here we are, with a slew of technologies that we can implement. And I think that that's another area where a tremendous amount of progress, but also advancements can be made.
Well, and Mina, you mentioned, the utility and the necessity of so many technologies over these past 9 months in delivering patient care for patients with COVID or without. How much of that do you think, or how many lessons have you learned that might inform, greater reliance on technology in the future, or just other innovations that you might be able to implement in a post-pandemic world?
Oh, the lessons are tremendous, and certainly there is no going back to the way things were previously. And I think, as I mentioned before, a lot of what we innovated on were things that we were planning to do or thinking of doing anyway. We all know that there have been issues with access to care, with efficacy, quality of care, with social determinants of health and addressing those. And so in some ways, we just accelerated good work that was already going on. And so being able to leverage the learnings, not only which technology platforms, but who is it appropriate for, in what types of scenarios, what are the workflows that you need to create around that so that you can be as productive and effective as possible? And to other points that have been made, what are patient preferences as well? Because we now have a plethora of options, and it's not always one size fits all. And being able to determine when certain types of approaches are appropriate, I think those are all lessons that we will be taking forward. And another one that hasn't been mentioned yet, but I thought would be, as another theme of where the pandemic exposed things that were already there being worked on, but just really created that accelerator, if you will, and that burning platform. Healthcare, frontline worker wellness. Burnout was a huge issue even before the pandemic. And certainly MedStar Health and other health systems were already investing in workforce wellness as part of general initiatives, because it has been shown through studies that it improves patient safety, healthcare quality, and also promotes retention and employee satisfaction. Well, now, as we all know through the pandemic, provider burnout and frontline worker burnout is a huge, huge issue. And so at MedStar Health, we have accelerated all of our workforce wellness activities, including using chatbots to be able to communicate with our employees, to get a better sense of how people are feeling, to be able to expedite care to employee assistance programs or to other behavioral health services as needed, utilizing platforms like, caregiving platforms to be able to provide, in a pinch, childcare support, platforms for obtaining food for our workers. I think that Megan mentioned transportation for essential workers, where when public transportation is not safe, how do you get essential workers to and from their sites of work? And so that has been another area where the pandemic has enabled an acceleration of work that was going on, and that I think moving forward, those organizations that were able to be agile during this pandemic also demonstrate resilience for the longer term, because you are now looking at how you can incorporate new ways of doing things, new ways of thinking into how you are providing care, not only for your patients and your communities, but for your employees as well.
Well, and Megan, I'm curious what you think, maybe on a system-wide level. We've seen so much innovation and so much agility, as Mina put it, of people adapting to the pandemic. How can we keep that momentum in a post-pandemic world? Like, I'm not suggesting I want everyone to be behaving as though they are under a pandemic at all times, but so many clever and good things have come about because of this. Is there a way to sort of sustain that pace so that we can just count on more innovation from our system?
Well, I think one thing that we've all talked about is social determinants of health, and the first time we mentioned it, I think, was in the past 2 or 3 minutes. So I think that what this has really highlighted is just how vulnerable people are, which Mina had talked about, the great disparities that we have, and that we don't really have a way to identify what people need and deliver it to them, maybe not in a very specific form of bringing things to people. That could be one mode. But I think what it really gets down to me is how do we identify what the needs are for people? And then how do we automate that to the extent that we can? So one thing that we're really focused on, and this is an example of a way that I think we could continue moving at a very rapid pace, is currently there's no way to really identify and codify social determinants of health. So in healthcare, if you don't code it, it's never really happened. And if I come in and I'm transportation insecure and I'm meeting with my physician, and if they do think to ask, well, this is your follow-up plan. Can you get there? Can you get to the pharmacy to get your drug? Can you get to your next appointment? Could be, are you housing insecure? It could be a whole slew of things. How do we make sure that that is coded in the clinical infrastructure? So in the electronic medical record, how does that follow that patient through every clinical, financial, administrative system that anyone who interacts with Megan knows? And then how can we say, I see that you're transportation insecure. I can see that you're food insecure. These are the programs. This is the assistance that I can bring to you. Because right now it's very, very manual. A patient has to feel local enough to advocate for themselves, which, as we all know, is not always the case. We deal a lot with Medicaid. And if I think of ways in which me as a healthcare professional have sometimes had a hard time advocating for myself, I think about how can, a Medicaid single mother, Spanish speaking, effectively advocate for herself and her child when she doesn't know how the system even works. So how can we codify these things and make it automatic? And that's where I think we're going to see, because we've uncovered these needs, we're going to have to figure out a way to be more efficient at delivering social determinants of care and how to pay for them, because I don't think we figured that out either. We have, one-off situations. Angela talked about, insurers maybe taking on additional types of benefits. But we really have to continue to invest in research and proving that somebody's care is way, way bigger than the actual interaction with the physician, interaction with the pharmacy. It's much, much more holistic than that. And when we get to that as a country, I think we're really going to be able to have much, much better healthcare outcomes.
It's one thing to have an unprecedented amount of information. It's another to design systems by which you can turn that into something that actually benefits patients in their care. And so, I was curious, Mina, now that you've had electronic medical records for a long time, but in recent times, now that there's just this deluge of information available, how are you finding, either the difficulties of implementing it or maybe some of the success stories in actually translating that information into tools that can really help people?
Yes, it is very important to have data, but have data that's usable and actionable. And that's where we spend quite a bit of time. How do you synthesize information, not only in the electronic medical record, but ideally, and Megan had mentioned this before, even outside of the electronic medical record, to be able to synthesize that, for example, to have some predictive modeling of who are patients who are at risk for certain conditions or for things to go south, so that you can leverage those to be able to guide decision making. And I think traditionally we think about it in that interface between the data and the provider, but increasingly we also need to think of the interface as a three-way triangle. You have the data and you have the provider and the patient. And how do we engage people in those conversations, in figuring out what they would like and what is best for them in terms of how they want to be cared for. And so, what is usable data for someone who has gone to medical school is not necessarily usable data for everyday people. And so there's that aspect as well that we need to think about, because increasingly, if we're going to be able to address a lot of the things that we've been discussing in this panel, it's going to take engagement of our communities and engagement of our patients, and not just, an algorithm that a provider follows and then, tells a patient, okay, now it's time to do X, Y, or Z. It really is a two-way street and a communication. And the last point that I'll make about data is also the interoperability and how that gets communicated. Because one of the issues is that you can have great data within your system, but people are not just staying within your particular system. And there needs to be good ways where you have information exchange across the various ways in which people are interfacing with the health system, with community organizations, with social services. There's a lot of room for improvement there, with post-acute care facilities, ability to have a better communication and flow of data and synthesis of that data so that you really do get that more holistic picture that is going to best enable care to be what the care that a person wants and that a person needs.
If I can chime in here about data as well, I think that there's, picking up on what Mina said, I think that there's a big patient empowerment angle here as well as it pertains to data. I'll give you one example of one of the things that we're doing. We have a partnership with Fitbit. And in this partnership, what we're doing is measuring arrhythmia or measuring heart rhythms for consumers. And over the course of time, what that consumer is going to be able to do is to see the data that he or she has about potentially having arrhythmias. And that is then going to empower the patient to be able to go to their healthcare provider and have that discussion. So I think that as Mina was saying, data can work in so many different ways. It can bring healthcare providers and patients and payers and healthcare systems together. But I think that we're also in a moment in time where this data can be made in a very user-friendly way to help patients be smarter about their own health and to be able to be much bigger advocates of their own health.
And Megan, I think you were in the middle of a concrete example when we lost you about how Lyft was working with electronic medical records to kind of make that a more seamless process. I don't know if you wanted to briefly summarize what maybe people didn't get a chance to hear.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know what was heard and what wasn't. We've recently done a partnership with Epic, which is one of the largest electronic medical records in the country, precisely for a few reasons. So the first, I'll just focus on operational efficiency. So the nurse, the administrator, the staff member can order a Lyft within the Lyft patient record at the time that they're scheduling an appointment or at the point of discharge, so they don't have to go into another system to do it. So that's incredibly important, just from probably speaks to what Mina was talking about burnout, right? It makes things easier for the staff, makes things faster for the patients, which is fantastic. But the other thing that we're really focused on is making sure that we do have specific codes for social determinants of health, which we're viewing as being important to then integrate into the electronic medical record. And then third, if you think about data, previously you'd have your ride data over here, you'd have your clinical and your financial data over here. Through our integration with Epic, it's all in one place. So if MedStar, for example, wanted to see what's the value of my transportation program? I'm spending money on transportation. How is that benefiting my patient population for population health, for clinical campaigns that I'm running? How is this budget? Is this money well spent or is it not? We are going to be able to create reports for people so that they can actually see how this one very particular social determinant of health, which is transportation, they can manage it and measure it. And what I often say is transportation is a social determinant of health, but it's also a conduit to many others. It is, you need it to get to food, to get to the pharmacy, to get to community events. If you're a senior and you're suffering from social isolation, like so many are during COVID. So we think all of that is really, really important. And we're excited about these partnerships that bring technology and data together to give people a fuller picture of what's going on and make smart decisions.
I want to go to a question we got from the audience, which was, how are we working with communities to ensure the dissemination of accurate information related to COVID-19 health guidelines, and as we gear up for vaccine distribution? I think there's a lot of nuance to that, but I was curious, zooming in on one aspect of it, Angela, Pfizer being involved in the development of a COVID-19 vaccine, and the company has spoken to the necessity of enrolling a population that looks like the United States and that reflects, some of the disproportionate effects of the virus that we were talking about earlier. I don't know. Can you speak to that a little bit? How do you approach, interfacing with communities when it comes to, communicating information about COVID-19 that might be kind of nuanced?
Yeah. Well, like I was saying earlier, we are really in the business of communication, because whenever we have a new medicine that we have to bring to the world, we have we're just full on with our ability to be able to communicate the benefits both to our physician audience as well as to our patient audience. But I think that in this specific regard, in terms of the COVID vaccine, there are a number of ways to do it. Some of which are very typical to how we would typically do things, but others not, right? And I think that the first difference here is that we're obviously still in a period of time where we're not approved yet, and we don't also understand and have. You heard Dr. Hahn speak about this earlier. What kind of approval are we going to get? So in this period of time, what we are doing is working through intermediaries, so public health agencies, key medical associations, key patient advocacy associations, using the resources and the tremendous amount of expertise around education, but also around vaccines that we know in general, and really supporting these intermediaries in these other forms of education to be able to assist them in providing the education. So that's one way you could go, right? You don't have to do it yourself. You use other mechanisms and other professional organizations who also do this as a key objective to support the broader public, in fact, to understand it. And a lot of that has already gone on. We have a large number of partnerships with a number of large organizations, medical organizations, like I said, patient organizations, public health organizations, to really bring our resources together so that we can drive home the messages around why is vaccinations important, how do you understand, the process for how these vaccines were developed, and how to answer questions around, your concerns. So that's one way. The other way is for us to do it directly, and we do this, but we do this when we have an approval. So obviously for that, because we don't have approval yet, these are all the plans that we have in the works. And once we know what kind of product we have, what the attributes of those products are, then we'll be able to specifically educate around that as well. So right now we're using, knowing that vaccine hesitancy, as Dr. Hahn spoke about earlier, but also the need to educate the public is so important. We're really leveraging a wide range of resources to be able to do that. And of course, being also very considerate and specific about education initiatives and education pieces that are specifically geared for minority populations, and making it relevant, right, to the entire population. It's not a one size fits all. People are going to take in information and understand it in different ways. And so we also have to be very conscious and thoughtful, but also very targeted in serving up information that's relevant for those populations. So it's not just sort of like a peanut butter spread. So all of that is going on right now.
And Mina, you spoke about how technology has allowed you to interface with patients on a different level than was possible before. But maybe the double-edged sword is that technology has allowed your patients to consume disinformation at an unprecedented level as well. I guess I'm curious. How are you dealing with communicating those guidelines, and how do you kind of respond when maybe patients have been misinformed on some aspect of either COVID-19 safety guidelines, the science of it, or the potential of vaccine?
I think you just have to partner and you have to keep engaging. And to piggyback off of something that Angela said, the leveraging networks of organizations, people who engage with communities is also important, because people are more likely to listen to people who are in a similar situation as them, who are coming from the same community as they are. And being able to have that kind of reach and engage in a two-way dialogue increases the likelihood of understanding, of following, of engaging, of asking questions. And all of that is what is going to get us to a better place when people are bombarded all the time. A lot of this comes down to relationships, and those relationships might be virtual or they might be in person, but those relationships are important. And to piggyback off of something that Commissioner Hahn had said about making sure that the vaccine trials are representing the people in America, I think similarly, the education that we provide to our patients should be given by people who are representing the people in America, because that's how, to the point that Angela made, you're going to know more of the nuances of what one person needs to hear and how they process things and understand versus another person. And so really being able to embrace that diversity as part of an engagement strategy is critical.
And Megan, how does Lyft Healthcare think about your role is not necessarily one of communication, but you are a direct patient interfacing organization in terms of providing rides. And so I don't know what kind of thought went into how one communicates things like this about COVID.
For us, obviously, we anchor to CDC guidelines, right? That's probably the most important thing for us, is to make sure that we are doing that and that we're communicating that. We're clear with our riders and our drivers around what's expected of them, and that we, quite frankly, enforce what's expected of them so that we can make a Lyft ride safe for everyone. We're very conscientious about the health and safety of our drivers, as much so as we are on our riders, whether that's a patient or a member or a business traveler. That's very important to Lyft. Now, in terms of COVID itself, I don't know that is Lyft's role, right? I think that particularly because we're a business-to-business platform, it's incumbent upon our partners, whether that's the health system, the payer, the transportation manager, whoever is administering that ride for the patient, to make sure that they are communicating with them around what's expected in terms of health and safety, and ensuring that those people will adhere to it. It's our job then to talk to our drivers and tell us what's expected of them and to make sure that they adhere to it.
So one thing we had discussed before in the context of the, I guess now cliche, patient journey is, that each of you plays a role in that spectrum, but that I think, everyone had kind of expressed some frustration that in many cases a patient is kind of left alone to fend for him or herself at various kind of friction points along the system. And I was curious, Mina, is there anything, is that something that can be innovated? Do you see kind of gaps in the continuum where really anybody at the table could maybe step up and improve outcomes for patients in terms of where they're being left behind?
Absolutely. I think this is a lot of the work that we are doing in care transformation. How do you integrate across all of the different aspects of where people interface with the system and try to make it as easy as possible for them so that they're not left navigating everything? And this comes back to some of what I think Megan was referring to around the data and around how can we share that across all of the different aspects so that a patient isn't the one who's coming and carrying a big binder full of all of their lab test results and telling each person that they see all of their medical problems from scratch. This is where interoperability comes into play. This is where these predictive analytics come into play so that it's not left to the guesswork of the patient to try to figure out, what they need to say or ask or do, but that there are systems in place to support that.
Well, and Angela, what role does Pfizer potentially play in that? Because as you mentioned, you're identifying patients, you're running clinical trials and facilitating these diagnoses. I don't know, do you see a chance to improve that continuum from your angle?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that is our life's work, is to continuously be able to find more and better ways to support our patients, because to your point, it is, we're involved in every stage of their life, from the time that they're diagnosed to the time that they choose a treatment, whoever's treatment it is, and then they got to stay on treatment in order to be successful in managing the disease. So that, like, nowhere can we not be supporting them, right? And that is how we think about our work. And we actually literally use that word patient journey in our work every single day, which is, where are we on this patient journey? What problem are we trying to solve? What opportunity are we trying to create? And how do we make this as seamless an experience as possible? Because in the end, I could have the greatest drug in the world, but if people don't get diagnosed properly, or they don't get treated properly, or worst of all, they got the treatment, but they don't stay on it, then we didn't get the outcome that we wanted ultimately for the patient. And that means we didn't get our job done. So every single day, we're looking at new and better ways to diagnose patients, to be able to ensure that they get the right treatment, even if it's not mine, even if it's not a Pfizer drug, right? Because we care that the patients get what it is that they need. And then we support them in all the ways possible to stay on their drugs and to be compliant with their drugs. And I shared even today a number of examples of where we had these interventions, at the diagnosis level, at the treatment level, at the medication adherence level. And honestly, it is just it's a daily journey and an infinite I think an infinite sort of approach that we have. It sort of never ends in terms of how you can make things better and better. So we take this seriously. You know, we monitor what our drugs are doing. We monitor what diagnosis rates are for, you know, pick any disease that we're in. We monitor treatment rates. We monitor adherence rates, and because we're organized at Pfizer by disease area. So, right, oncology as an example, or rare diseases, or internal medicine, vaccines, so on and so forth. Every business is looking at these measures every single day to ultimately improve the lives of patients. So it's very much, you know, I guess in our DNA to think about our patients in their journey and helping them at every single one of these milestones. And it's going to look different per drug, right? What the drug does and what the patient needs, depending on what that drug is. But it's always some version of those three things.
And Damien, I think there's also the partnership, like, for example, with the three people you have on this panel, right? Where you have people who are interfacing with the patient from their particular perspectives, but that it's important that we all partner with each other so that we create that continuum for that person. I think that's also key, the partnerships that providers, in the various way that they provide care and services for our communities, are engaging with each other as well.
Well, and I was going to say, Megan, you mentioned before that Lyft's business is in many ways bringing people to things, but also bringing things to people. So kind of with in mind what we've talked about, where things fall through the cracks on the patient journey, you know, what kind of role could Lyft play in terms of, you know, when patients can't get access to whether it be technology for telehealth or their drugs? Is that something that could come into play there?
Absolutely. I mean, we're doing that now, right, with food and medical supplies. I think you'll see more from Lyft in the future around bringing things to people. You know, we have interested organizations who serve senior populations who maybe can't figure out how to do a telehealth visit, right? So there's pre-configured iPads, right, that they have, which is very, very simple for someone who's not very tech savvy to use. How do you that senior if they don't have access to transportation and don't have a loved one that can take that to them? Pharmaceuticals is a perfect example, right? Lyft is a ubiquitous network. We've got 2 million drivers across the United States. We can typically get anywhere between 3 to 7 minutes. We've got obviously a rock solid technology backbone. So I think you'll see a lot more from Lyft over in terms of both directions, people to things, things to people. And in addition to that, Damien, I think it's really important, hinging on something that Mina said around measuring for outcomes, no matter what it is. So if we know that someone who's transportation insecure is in the ED, end up in an inpatient visit, less likely to adhere to a treatment plan if they have chronic disease, less likely to go to primary care visits, and they just become sicker. At what point do we say, you know, we're willing to spend $15, $20 on a Lyft ride to get that patient to that? And then Lyft is investing in third-party outcomes-based research, which will take us several years to get to. But what we want to show is if you make that investment upfront, this is how you're going to see the return of the long term and decrease and increased health outcomes. And so hopefully we'll be sitting back here in that conversation.
Great. Well, I know we're just about out of time, so I wanted to thank Megan, Angela, and Mina for joining me, and everybody for tuning in and for bearing with us during our brief hiatus there in the middle. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.